African Literature Association online lecture series. My name is Simon Lewis, and I'm joining you from my office in Charleston, South Carolina, in the United States, somewhat anxiously watching Tropical Storm Imelda a few hundred miles to our southeast. I currently have the honor of serving as the president of the ALA, and I am the outgoing coordinator of these lectures. It's been a tremendous pleasure and a privilege to run this lecture series the last few months. And I do want to thank everybody who's been involved with them conceptually, in front of the camera, behind the scenes. Special thanks to Professor Akin Adesokan, who first came up with the idea, and to Lexi Langendorf for her trusty working of the Zoom and YouTube logistics, and to Farah Bakari for online promotion and communication. Starting from next month, fourth Saturday, October the 26th, I believe that is, the new coordinator of the series will be Professor Carly Coetzee of the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. Professor Coetzee brings not only her formidable scholarly reputation to the series, but an extraordinary range of institutional experience and academic networks that truly span the globe. The reason she can't be here today, for instance, is that she is busy with the biennial conference of the African Studies Association of Africa in Cabo Verde. Under her coordination, I look forward to this series going from strength to strength, and I want to publicly express my appreciation to Professor Coetzee for taking on the role. Now, just in case anybody hasn't attended one of these lectures before, I'd like to take a further minute or so just to explain how we operate. Our guest lecturer today, Professor Stephanie Bosch Santana, is on Zoom with me and our moderator, Professor Moradewin Adejunmobi, along with our web whiz, Lexi Langendorf, while you all are watching via the ALA YouTube site. Professors Bosch Santana and Adejunmobi are both with us, by the way, from California this morning, so it's only just 8 o'clock in the morning, and we owe them special thanks for being here so early for them. If you're watching this feed live, please go ahead right now and let us know on the YouTube chat where it is that you're logging in from. We love to see the global reach of this format. Given the very considerable political and cultural headwinds that we're contending with nowadays, it's fantastic and important to be able to maintain a community of African literary scholars in this fashion. Another benefit of the format is that you can post comments and questions whenever they occur to you during the presentation without interrupting the speaker or without losing your own thought. So please feel free to put those comments and suggestions into the YouTube chat at any time. Lexi will be monitoring the chat and feeding those questions and comments to our presenters for the discussion session after the lecture. And of course, you can always post comments well after the event on the ALA's Facebook page and keep the discussion going online on that platform if you want. So those are the technical arrangements. Let me now briefly introduce today's highly distinguished moderator, Professor Moradewin Adejunmobi. As I mentioned, Professor Adejunmobi is joining us from California, where she's a professor of African American and African Studies at the University of California, Davis, and a scholar of African literature and African popular culture. She's particularly interested in multilingualism, translation, and intercultural communication in African literature and popular culture, including the circulation trajectories and regimes of value for African popular film. She's published widely on these subjects, and in 2019, with Carly Coetzee, published the wonderfully comprehensive Routledge Handbook of African Literature. Her editing skills, and by extension her cat herding prowess, is underscored by the fact that for the last 6 years, she has been the editor-in-chief of the ALA's scholarly organ, JALA, the Journal of the African Literature Association. In that role, and in many others on the Executive Council, Professor Adejunmobi has been an institutional stalwart of the ALA, having served as president of the association in 2014-2015. It's thus with great admiration, as well as with great appreciation, that I now turn this event over to her. Thank you, Moradewin. All yours.
Thank you to Professor Lewis for that generous introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the ALA family, wherever you happen to be. I have a great pleasure this morning, it's morning where I happen to be in California, of introducing our speaker for today. So let me go ahead and get started with that introduction. Stephanie Bosch Santana is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California at Los Angeles. She has a BA from UC Berkeley in California and an MA and PhD from Harvard University. Her interests are in African literature, transnational and diasporic literature, digital literature, as well as urban and spatial studies. Her first monograph, Forms of Mobility, Genre, Language and Media in African Literary Cultures, was published by Northwestern University Press in 2024. Based on an unstudied archive of texts in English and Chichewa / Nyanja from Malawi, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, Forms of Mobility proposes alternate categories of fiction, migrant forms, township tales, weekend stories, Pan-African time machines, and digital diaries through which to examine how writers envisaged the region's changing literary and political terrains. By reading these forms in motion as they travel across space, time, genre, language, and between publications and platforms, this study limns multiple centers of literary influence and relation across Southern Africa and Black diasporas, and reveals forms of literary mobility and space making that are occluded by current models of world literature. As such, we can say that Forms of Mobility is a book that not only teaches us about African literature, but it also invites us to rethink how we envision the concept of world literature and the role of different forms of mobility in constituting a corpus for both world and regional literature. Professor Bosch Santana was co-editor of Digital Africas, a special issue of Post-Colonial Text in 2020, and has contributed essays on digital and print literatures and reading cultures to the Routledge Handbook of African Literature, published in 2019, and a companion to African literature, published in 2021. From 2006 to 2008, she assisted with South Africa's BTA Anglo Platinum Short Story Competition and is co-founder of the Malawian Girls Literary Competition, which celebrates young women's writing in English and Chichewa. Let me also say that I have had the pleasure of listening to Professor Bosch Santana make presentations at panels and many different conferences, and I have always found her presentations to be highly insightful and very informative. So you are all in for a treat today. Please join me in extending a very warm ALA welcome to Professor Stephanie Bosch Santana. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Moradeun, for that extremely generous introduction. I want to thank the African Literature Association, which I've been a member of now for more than a decade, for this wonderful opportunity to present my work, and also, of course, to Simon Lewis for organizing the talk today, as well as Lexi Langendorf for her assistance. I also want to do a quick shout out to my little daughter, Madeline, who's watching from home, although probably likely to tune in to something else very shortly. In any case, let me share my screen and slides. All right, so today I'll be talking about my book, Forms of Mobility, which came out almost a year ago in November 2024. And the book is really interested in the ways that Southern African writers have imagined mobility and movement since the mid-20th century, especially outside of the ways that it's commonly depicted in this region as either forced labor migration or on the other side of the spectrum as this kind of unfettered cosmopolitan or Afropolitan travel. And the book is also interested in the ways that these narratives of mobility travel themselves and how and why they change as they travel. So when I talk about travel, I mean real geographic travel across international borders, but also within smaller circuits that aren't usually discussed in world literary studies. And the travel that takes place, for example, as readers engage with literature in newspapers or on smartphones, as they move within different cities, usually via or often via minibus or combi. And by travel, I also mean how forms travel across different platforms and publications through reprintings in other magazines or anthologies, for example, and also across genres and media. So what happens when a story that has been ubiquitous in print in Southern Africa for more than a century, the Jim or Jane comes to Joburg story, the story of travel to the big city, what happens when that is published on a blog where thousands of readers from across the region, continent, and globe can now engage with it, usually in multiple languages? So in other words, the mobility that I'm talking about is this really capacious idea of how forms travel across space, time, medium, genre, and language. And my focus in the book is on the way that literary forms are fundamentally shaped by these different forms of mobility, as well as the ways that Southern African writers have used these mobile forms to express complex spatial imaginaries. The lecture I'm giving now is, of course, a different way that my own book is traveling, in this case via Zoom and YouTube, remote audiovisual media, whose affordances are very different than print. And as such, I wanted to take this opportunity to really give visual form to some of the book's larger archive, especially since part of the book's argument is that we need an expanded archive of African literary cultures, one that includes forms from newspapers, magazines, and now digital platforms, all of which I and others argue are really essential parts of African literatures. So this image is an expanded version of the book's cover, which is a painting called Waiting On Forever by a Malawian artist, Franco K. Mbilizi, who I'm enormously grateful to for allowing me to use this image for the book's cover. And this larger image shows a greater portion of the landscape surrounding these figures and this kind of colorful, tangled mass that they're observing in the sky. And to me, this highlighted a couple of important things about forms of mobility. The first being that this isn't really about singular texts, but about these kinds of masses of texts and genres that often travel together as part of larger publications, whether they be newspapers, magazines, or as part of platforms like Facebook or Wattpad. And it was really important to me as I was doing my research for this book over many, many years that I read the texts that I was considering within the context of their larger publications. And this meant reading thousands and thousands of pages of material, much of which is not dealt with in the book itself. But I wanted to recreate as much as possible the experience of reading that readers at the time would have had with these publications, flipping through the pages, looking at advertisements and other materials, scrolling through content on Facebook, and generally reading stories that appear alongside one another. And the second thing that really drew me to this painting is the fact that it still contains human figures, which speaks to the importance of the individuals involved in this process, the African writers, critics, publishers, editors, who are doing what I call reading in motion as they observe, engage, and shape these forms for their own writing, for their own publications and platforms, and who ultimately use them to navigate changing literary and political terrains. And this book really focuses on Southern Africa, which has to do with my own experiences living and working in the region. So after after I finished at UC Berkeley, I moved to Southern Africa to work with reading and literary activist Beulah Thumbadu, who had run a national short story competition, who had run a national reading campaign called Masifunde Sonke, or Let Us Read Together. And at the time that I worked for her from 2006 to about 2008, she was running a national short story competition that she had been growing since its first iteration in 1990. And paired with the short story competition was Beulah's Million Books campaign. This was an effort to publish low-cost booklets of the competition's winning stories and to distribute them widely across South Africa. And these books were small, portable, and meant to fit in your pocket so that you could have it ready to read wherever you might find yourself. And you can see that these books are not much larger than an iPhone. And for me, it's really interesting to see the way that digital devices and digital literatures have really succeeded in filling this need for cheap, portable reading material that literary activists like Beulah were trying to find and address many, decades ago. So inspired by Beulah's project, I worked with the Malawi Writers Union to launch the Malawian Girls Short Story Competition in 2007, which was aimed at secondary schools secondary school girls writing in English and Chichewa. And we also published small, easily portable versions of these stories. And one of my favorite memories is when my Chichewa teacher at graduate school, Chichewa and Kumba, came back from a trip to Malawi, and he said that he had been just on a minibus somewhere in Blantyre and had happened to see somebody reading the book. And this really showed me sort of the ways that this material was traveling beyond the places where we had distributed it, which was mostly to secondary schools. And you can see a picture of some of the winners of the competition the first time we ran it. And on the right is Pamela Miti, who was actually the first prize winner. So both of these literary competitions and the literary forms they produced really form the kind of subterranean archive of this book, informing it without really entering into it in an explicit way, save for a few of the stories from the competition that I engaged with in the book's third chapter to show the way that these young Malawian writers are challenging some of the received notions of women's mobility, especially as they were presented in stories in the national newspaper, these kinds of weekend stories that really form an important part of the Malawian literary canon. So I want to turn now to give an example of what I consider to be a kind of quintessential form of mobility that I address in the book's introduction. And this is a letter that originally appeared in a publication called Viaro na Viaro, or Here and Beyond, published in Nyasaland, or today's Malawi. And the letter was written by a Nyasa man who had emigrated to Northern Rhodesia, today's Zambia, and it was republished in the version you see here in the UK's Manchester Guardian in November 1937 as an African pioneer in defense of migration. And so this letter, which really traveled well beyond its original place of publication and its original language, is significant not only for the distance it traveled, but also for its illustration of what this kind of mobility could afford. And in this case, it affords the opportunity to provide an African perspective on the question of mobility itself, especially the forms of migration that were happening in Southern Africa at the time. And so this appeared in the paper as part of a larger conversation on the pages of The Guardian about the issue of labor migration in the British Protectorate of Nyasaland, which was largely presented in the British press as a kind of tragic exodus that was destroying village and family life. What the writer of this letter does is to kind of dismiss this longstanding colonial view of Africans as static and immobile by giving the example of the chief of his own village, an immigrant from another unnamed country, who styled himself as the one who crossed over. And in this way, the writer points to the long history of migration in the region that predates colonial intervention. And the other thing the writer does is to point to the fact that the desire to emigrate for a better life is not only an African phenomenon, but to highlight the fact that countless immigrants, including Europeans, have come to Southern Africa for just this reason. In other words, we find this very cosmopolitan or Afropolitan vision of migration in this letter from the 1930s. And to me, this letter really encapsulates the idea of forms of mobility as forms that both travel themselves and that imagine mobility in particular ways. And so what I do in the book is to look at really 4 different forms, and I'll show the table of contents here: migrant forms, township tales, weekend stories, time machines, and digital diaries. And each of these forms imagines mobility in particular ways, from the kind of regional migration that the migrant forms are expressing, that show this kind of attention to migration as this important transnational phenomenon, but that also show some of the real labor issues that migrants were facing, to the kinds of time machines that I talk about in the 4th chapter, that are really engaging with older print forms in order to reanimate certain ideas of Pan-Africanism that were prevalent in these 20th century print publications. So one of the essays that helped me to kind of clarify my thinking about forms of mobility is Yvonne Ower's essay, Imagined Waters, that was published in 2015 in the Chimurenga Chronic. And in it, she describes the way that the boatmen on the Congo River use songs as navigational devices, or as what she calls poem maps, in order to sing their boats safely down the river. And this is the image that appears alongside her essay, which shows some of the water routes that are not commonly visualized, the power struggles also over water, that aren't given prominence usually on maps of the continent. And we can see the way that focusing in on water and these lesser traveled water routes really changes our perception of space. So Ower's poem maps are very similar to what I'm calling forms of mobility, in that these are forms that are born of motion in the sense of traveling across time, space, genre, language, etc., and that are used to navigate changing terrains, in this case, changing literary, social, and political terrains. And by paying attention to these forms on a granular level, which I attempt to do in this book, we get a sense of the process, really the iterative process, through which Southern African writers are navigating changing ideas of how they belong to communities at various spatial scales, from the township to the nation, region, wider continent, diaspora, and globe. And here I find Lashir, Marzagora, and Rossini's work on significant geographies to be really useful in terms of capturing the way that these are, as they say, conceptual, real, and imagined geographies. And that what's important is that they're given meaning by the people who produce, imagine, and use them. So just like this map of imagined waters, one of the things that forms of mobility do is to create different maps than the ones that have often defined literary studies from this region. So often scholarly volumes on Southern Africa focus primarily on South Africa and treat the rest of the region as, in Stefan Helgeson's words, its peripheries. So on the other hand, when Zimbabwean, Malawian, and Zambian literatures are considered, it's usually as distinct national literatures with little attention in general to the kinds of connections between them. However, the way that all of these literatures from the region have been entangled really comes to the fore when we consider a magazine like African Parade, which was published out of the Central African Federation, a colonial entity that combined the British territories of Nyasaland, or today's Malawi, Northern Rhodesia, or Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And this is a map of the Federation as it appeared in a pro-Federation pamphlet in 1951 that was published by the United Central Africa Association, or the UCAA. And the UCAA was formed by pro-Federation settlers from both Rhodesias in an effort to really lobby Britain to unite the three territories, ostensibly as a means to prevent South African apartheid from spreading northward into the Federation. But as this map shows, there were really clear economic incentives for bringing together these three territories, such as the resources of the Zambian copper belt, the Wenke coal fields in southern Rhodesia, and importantly, the large pool of African labor in Nyasaland that southern Rhodesia was seeking to capture for its growing industries. So, as many have argued, space making is really was really at the heart of imperialist projects, and we see this very, very clearly, I think, in this pamphlet and the map that it includes. But what forms of mobility do, as I've said, is to try to create different maps that illuminate not only alternative spatial formations, but also ones that show the kinds of contingencies of map making itself by showing multiple itineraries and trajectories. So African Parade on the right here modeled itself on South Africa's iconic magazine Drum, and it touted itself as being the first modern magazine in Central Africa. It began publication just a couple of years after Drum in 1953. So you can see the two covers here and some of their similarities, where Drum is describing itself as Africa's leading magazine. Parade, in turn, says it's Central Africa's most widely read magazine. But then you probably can't read this, but in smaller font below the date, it also adds the only magazine in Southern Africa edited and printed by Africans for Africans. And this was a bit of a dig at Drum's white editorship. So, but Parade also, it's important to remember, was ultimately a pro-Federation magazine, and in many ways supported this larger colonial project, although its editors at the time didn't necessarily see it this way. So its first editor, Lawrence Vambe, from his perspective, the aim of the Federation was ultimately to create a kind of great African state. One that would have all of the natural and human resources of these different territories, and that would be able to stave off any sorts of narrow nationalist ambitions that might pit these former colonies against one another in the post-independence period. So really, Drum was using then this kind of, African Parade was using Drum's template in order to celebrate the people, cultures, music from across the Federation, which it is imagined as this kind of nation in the making. And I should note that Drum was read widely in Central Africa, but that Central Africa rarely featured in its pages outside of political news. And while one of Drum's first stories was by a Central African writer, Mbebe's Rhodesia Road, Drum stopped publishing fiction from Southern Africa almost entirely after that, and mostly focused on South African writers, occasionally publishing writers from West Africa. But for writers from sort of its immediate environs, it was actually really difficult to contribute to the pages of Drum, which is why writers were so excited when they had their own magazine, kind of their own version of Drum for Central Africa. And there were many notable writers from the region that published on Parade's pages. William Saidi, Steve Chimombo, Charles Mungochi, among them, published in Parade. And Parade also serialized the first novel in English by a Black Zimbabwean, Ndabaningi Sitole's Mbusi from 1959 to 1961. And serialized stories really were a favorite in Parade, and many of them were various kinds of travel stories that were really, that I think of through this lens of migrant forms and the ways that they were mapping the Federation in relation to the surrounding region, but also in relation to kind of broader geographies, other parts of the continent, and also the globe, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the magazine really did have this kind of broader geographic vision for itself, forging connections, both real and imagined, to other parts of the Anglophone world. And in particular, Parade often evoked the United States as a multiracial nation that the Federation might emulate. And Vambe was particularly interested in African American culture as a kind of model for Black achievement, although Parade was also attentive to racial inequities in the US in some of the ways that Drum was not. So what I'd like to do now is actually to flip through the pages of this issue of Parade from September 1957, both so that you get a sense of what the magazine looked like, but also to highlight the range of different geographies that it imagined. And moving through the pages, kind of reading in motion, as it were, we can see how these sometimes competing visions and affiliations sat side by side on the magazine's pages, creating this kind of map that moves in multiple directions at once. And I will pause occasionally just to highlight something. So you can see the cover girl on the front, which was a very common feature of magazines like Drum and Parade. Attention to local issues were important. Oh, it's sorry. Okay, I'm not going to try to stop it. I'm just going to let it go. So as I was saying, local issues were often featured, but these were often paired with attention to international issues. You'll see a pen pal page here now where there are shout outs to letters in Germany, letters coming from Germany and Australia. There's a readers page, what have you got to say, which was a key part of the magazine. There were always debates happening there. Pictures were obviously very important. You can see a lot of photographs of people from across the Federation. The essay, one of the essays that we just passed was by Vambe about his trip to cover a press conference by President Eisenhower, where he remarks that he was the only Black man in the assembly. There's also this big article on how African Parade had made its way into the Kenyan market. So this real interest in accessing readers there. Again, do you know these people from various parts of the Federation, kind of trying to create this sort of sense of nationalism within this space. Lots of advertisements for various kinds of products that signal upward social mobility. A travel story from Cape Town to Point Noir, again, kind of thinking about these stories of travel across the continent that appear again and again. And then the vernacular language pages, more toward the back of the magazine at this point, the one in Nyanja that we just passed, asks readers actually after the material, whether or not they'd like to continue having stories in African languages. And so this was something that was really constantly debated on the pages of the magazine. And eventually the vernacular languages were moved to a separate publication. So when we look at just this single issue of Parade in this way, we can see the way that it maps these kinds of multiple locations of literary and political influence and relation. It looks southward to South Africa via drum, taking so many cues from drum in terms of its form, style, and general presentation. But as we saw, it also looks to East Africa to kind of in seeking to establish a broader kind of continental presence, and then also to other parts of the globe, finding readers from across the English-speaking world, and in particular looking to the US and to Black America as a model for the kind of multiracial democracy that it might try to establish. As well as the kinds of literary production that it might foster. And as I talk about in the book's second chapter, which follows the itineraries of a form that I call the township tale, within these genres, there's also these kinds of broad spatial imaginaries. So I follow this kind of chain of adaptations of Langston Hughes's simple stories set in Harlem through Casey Motsitsi's On the Beat stories in Sophiatown, to several writers in the Federation like William C. Saidi, who we just saw a picture of, who wrote a similar column set in Harare Township, and then when he moved to Lusaka, also produced another column set there. And so in each of these, there's really a lot of attention to barriers and possibilities for movement within these different cities, as well as comparisons to similar locations across the globe. So Harare kind of reading itself in a way through Sophiatown, through Harlem, and then also attention to broader sort of really far-flung imaginaries of transcending kind of racial barriers on Earth by traveling to outer space. And this is really a common feature of all of these narratives, even ones that weren't kind of immediately aware of one another or adapting one another. And so with both this genre and with Parade in mind, I want us to think for a moment about Franco Moretti's assertion that the novel is the world literary sphere's most mobile genre. And he says that by paying attention primarily to the novel, we probably overestimate the mobility of world literatures. But in this context of Southern Africa, I think this simply isn't true. And Parade, we can see that Parade brought the first writing in English by Malawian, Zambian, and Zimbabwean writers to global audiences before the first novels in English from the region were even published, with the singular exception of Zambian writer Andrea Macie's The Lonely Village, published in 1951, which was a translation. In other words, I think we actually we actually underestimate the mobility of world literatures when we pay attention only to the novel, especially when considering literatures from understudied regions. So much of the book is dedicated to these different print forms and their kind of multiple overlapping geographies that they imagine. But in the book, I'm also interested in the ways that print and digital media overlap and interact with one another. And in the book's fourth chapter, called Time Machines, I turn to two digital age publications that really straddle print and digital forms, the Chimurenga Chronic and Jungle Gym magazine. Both of these magazines have robust digital presences, and they also circulate digitally as PDFs or as so-called Kindle pulp in the case of Jungle Gym. But what I'm interested in is the way that these publications have chosen to explicitly reanimate particular print forms, here, the newspaper and the pulp magazine, and why they've chosen to do this in the early 21st century, where everything seems to be digitizing. And in this chapter, I take Chimurenga's cue in describing the newspaper as a time machine to argue that the Chronic and Jungle Gym used 20th century print forms as time machines in order to chart new Pan-African affiliations. In large part because print enabled these kinds of engagement with multiple entangled geographies, as we just saw in the example of African Parade. So it's a kind of argument about what it is that print affords in terms of imagining this kind of more capacious Pan-Africanism that I think the Chronic especially is tapping into this particular medium. And one of the things that the Chronic does is really to use the newspaper as a kind of low-tech time machine, as it calls it, to put South Africa's so-called xenophobic violence in 2008 into a wider temporal and geographic frame. And this is one of the maps that it draws of one of the victims' journeys before and after the violence. So this is the 27-year period from when Moses Mhlanga left Mozambique through his various homes in South Africa, where he did eventually become a citizen before becoming targeted. So remapping South Africa's relationship to the wider continent is a key part of the Chronic's intervention, and an important way that it's rethinking the possibilities for Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. And so I really see the newspaper as being a key feature of how it's creating this kind of alternative Pan-African space-time. So as I said, forms of mobility are useful for reading across print and digital forms, I think. And as I discussed in the book's last chapter on digital diaries, there are new print forms like the diary chronicle or diary chron that are developing directly out of digital forms that are being published on platforms like Facebook and Wattpad. And you can see here that Bulabuka Publishers, which published Mike Maputo's well-known Diary of a Zulu Girl as a print book, touts itself as the pioneering publisher of Diary Chronicle. And they highlight how this form has traveled beyond South Africa's borders to other parts of the continent and world. And elsewhere, they describe this particular genre as taking the form of the diary, and that it generally tells the stories of young people and the relationships in the social media era. But for each one of the digital diaries that are published in print by Bulabuka, there are thousands of others that can amass thousands or even hundreds of thousands of followers, but that still go unpublished through traditional channels. And to me, this demonstrates these still very kind of fitful and uneven mobilities between material and virtual spheres. And I think this is particularly true for Afrophone fiction, which is generally less likely to make this kind of jump from digital to print, at least in this context. It varies widely, as you can see in the forthcoming issue of Jala on social media literatures that I've co-edited. But one of the things that we can see across the corpus of materials that I've described is that the issue of language remains a kind of key point of contention, and that it's heavily debated, especially in multilingual publications or platforms. So in African Parade, the inclusion of 4 vernacular languages was this source of constant debate. And it's also an issue that readers have taken up again in relation to digital fictions, usually in the comments section of these fictions. And as you can see from the comments here, which date to 1953 and to 2013, many of the debates that are happening today are very similar to those from more than half a century ago, to the extent that it's very difficult to tell them apart. So I've purposely left the dates off to show some of these similarities. There are, however, entire reading communities on platforms online today, on Facebook, Wattpad, on WhatsApp groups that are entirely dedicated to African language fiction. And thinking more about the role of reading communities like this is really where my work is headed now. So I'm particularly interested in the ways that online and offline reading communities overlap and the relationships between them. And to this end, I'm researching online book clubs and book influencers on Book Talk. And I'm also really thinking about really interested in the resurgence of so-called offline movements, such as silent book clubs, which exist globally and meet regularly in different public places, in parks, bookstores, pubs, and that bring together groups of strangers into the same space just to read together. So in one recent instance, the Silent Book Club in Cape Town gathered more than 250 people to read together on the train from Muizenberg back to Cape Town. And this to me is another kind of iteration of the reading in motion that I describe in this book. But rather than reading across platforms and publications to reach audiences in a kind of mediated way, this kind of reading in motion is fully communal, in person, and present. And I think it's at this kind of intersection of these different kinds of reading in motion that some of the future of African literary studies and African literatures lie. So this kind of reading in motion not only opens up our ideas of new geographies of affiliation, but it really transforms the world around us in a very real, material sense. And I want to end with this quote from the Cape Town Silent Book Club in their story on this event, where they said, "When enough people gather in a place, it becomes a place to gather." So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that wonderful presentation, lovely presentation. There's so much to learn from everything that you've said. For those who are joining us on YouTube, please post your questions and comments on for Professor Bosch Santana on YouTube, and we will be funneling the questions as we receive them and comments to her. But while waiting for our members, those who are watching, to start posting questions and comments about things that they have, let me start off just to inform myself. You ended by speaking about silent book clubs. Could you say a little bit more about that? What exactly does that entail? And yeah, how do people make sense of that?
Yeah, so I attended one recently in Los Angeles, and you find out about it online. So there is this kind of way that it's this sort of paravirtual engagement, in that it still is something that is facilitated by these online platforms. But then they give directions to a particular location and time, and you just sort of bring a book and hope you find them, in my case, wander around a park, and then sit down and read. And some of them are more social than others, from what I can tell. I've noticed that a lot of the ones in Cape Town tend to have a dedicated social hour after. The one I went to was fairly subdued, in that most people even just read through the sort of break in the reading. And so, it became something that I read, I didn't talk to a single soul, and left. But I'm headed to South Africa next month, and I'm hoping to attend more of these and get a sense of how they work in different places. But this sort of global movement, I mean, there's also the Logging Off Club, that again has global chapters where people meet to put their phone down and go for a walk together, or have a meal together without sort of digital mediation, even though it's digital mediation that kind of brought them there. So to me, what's really interesting is these intersections between these kinds of online and offline communities, and what kinds of communities form out of these online spaces. And some of them still have, some of the sort of book clubs online that I'm looking at still have really important kind of online features. So there are kind of book clubs that will post their entire sessions on YouTube, and you can watch and hear what people think about whatever book they're reading. So I've been trying to read along with some of these book clubs and follow and get their takes on some of this material, which has just been, a real pleasure to engage with from afar. And now I'm hoping to engage, in the actual kind of present communal version of it as well.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. A new way to think about how literature is consumed, read, and yes, very interesting, very interesting. We have one question from Anne Gulick, and it's a question that I had in mind as well. And she says she's interested in your thoughts on what kind of purchase print still has in this moment, especially given what you've said about print not being as accessible to Afrophone authors who are writing in African languages. And I will add my own question to hers, because it was something that occurred to me when you talked about the authors of the what did you call them? The diary crons, and some of them moving from the digital space to print. And I was curious about their motivations. What are their motivations for being, having their works, their fiction published in print anyway, since it's already circulating online? So those two questions together.
Yeah, this is a really important and great question. So thank you, Anne and Moradeu, also. I think print, what's interesting is, as I've discovered from editing this special issue of Jala on social media, Afrophone literatures, it really is something that varies by context. So there are a lot of local factors that come into this. So in some of the kind of Hausa erotic fiction that is covered really extensively in this forthcoming issue, you see that censorship has played such a key role. So the censorship of print has meant that this genre exists online exclusively. And writers have found really inventive ways to monetize it through WhatsApp groups and through, having sort of their own way of monetizing it. But it is sort of, every writer has to kind of figure that out for themselves because platforms, maybe like Okada books, haven't survived. And so it does become something where I think writers end up doing a lot of, there's a reason that writers in online are often called admins, because they have to do a lot of this kind of administrative labor of getting their own work out there and finding a way to monetize it. So I'll direct you to the wonderful pieces in that special issue by Zainab Ango and Uma Lia Musa and others, Abdallah Adamu, who talk about this literature. And then in the Swahili context, there's, again, a different kind of set of factors where print really still has this kind of important currency, where these sort of even, there's an experimental novel that my co-editor, Uta Rooster-John, talks about that was co-written on Facebook, but then finished in print and sold. So that became this kind of innovative model to actually monetize the book through print. And in the Swahili context, print still has this kind of cachet. There's this, this sort of deference to print, as James Yeku has described, where it still is this kind of aesthetic and sort of literary value that is automatically attached to it, right? And monetary value. And in Southern Africa, we see something quite sort of mixed in that you see some places where there is an emphasis on print, and print still being seen as this kind of, you've made it as an author, right? If you can turn your Facebook publication into a print form. But what I think is so interesting is that I think there are different, especially with these literary communities that I'm looking at now, there's something else people are looking for sometimes through creating these communities or writing these diaries. And sometimes it is just that, it's the community. And so it's, there are writers like I talk about in the book, Thulani Lupondwana, who didn't care if she was ever published. She had more than 65,000 followers for her Xhosa diary, and she just persisted in writing in Xhosa, even though she had readers who complained. And she just, for her, it was more about having that space and that outlet and that creating that community. And we do see more and more people, I think, around Book Talk and Bookstagram, not just sort of creating content for online spaces, but then also creating these offline spaces where they actually gather with people. So I think that's, print varies across the continent, but I think it has to do in part with whether people are really interested mostly in monetizing their work to some degree, which in some cases print can provide, and gaining that sort of literary sort of cachet in some cases, or in some cases deciding entirely that that's not important to them and that they are seeking something else, that maybe a print book isn't necessary for them.
Thank you for that. As I said before we started, I'm learning new terminology today, like book talk and bookstagram. Is that what it's called? So these are terms that I was not previously familiar with. We have two other questions that have come in. I'm going to read the first one and allow you to respond to that before going on to the next question. And this is from Chimnoirem Okorafor, and who writes, I'm curious if bodies feature in your research on maps, spaces, language, and mobility. I'm interested in the Black female body as a form of resistance, just to give you a bit of context.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. I think because I'm working in part kind of in this book, at least on these sorts of mediated forms, the body doesn't come in as centrally. We see these kinds of mediated depictions, right, especially of the Black female body on the cover of magazines like Drum and African Parade. So there are certainly ways that kind of these images are being circulated, and then ways that young writers, as I talked about from the Malawian Girls Literary Competition, are kind of writing against some of these depictions, both in English and Chichewa. But I wouldn't say that the body and sort of the reading body, as it were, is necessarily a part of that project. I think this is something that will likely come in much more into this next project when it's a project about actual readers, people in space, and the body is obviously a really key part of that, experience of being in one of these clubs and reading together. So I think, your work, the body as a site of resistance sounds fascinating, but this isn't something that I've explored explicitly yet.
Thank you. I think it's actually also interesting the way, at least on a visual level, the Black female body was used by Drum and also Parade. And I imagine different kinds of representations of the Black female body are also used for some of the romance diaries that are being published, if they make it to print now. So there is a circulation of the female body, maybe in the text in certain ways, the Black female body, but also just visually in terms of helping the text to circulate, which is an interesting subject for someone to study.
Yeah, especially since these are usually male writers and editors, right? Who
right,
are putting material out there. And a lot of work has been done kind of on Drum on this subject, But yes, the diaries too, and the fact that a lot of these diaries were being written by men, kind of posing as these young women, and audiences deciding, actually, these representations work for me, because these are largely female audiences. But I do think that's changed drastically. I mean, Maputo's diary, that's more than 10 years ago now. So now you have this whole kind of raft of young female writers who have gotten into this space, are doing their own writing, and then of course this whole, which I'm just kind of starting to tap into, but romantasy fiction that is all kind of women writers, women readers. So book talk is largely women writers and readers, I would say. And so that is very much this kind of space where I think these questions will come to the fore.
Thank you for that. I think for those who are watching, there's obviously a lot of research to be done when it comes to questions of gender and these new types of texts, the ways in which they circulate, and the modalities that they rely on for their circulation. So there's a lot happening there. Okay, next question from Estelle Finley. I find many connections with literature and authors in Equatorial Guinea in your work, especially in this concept of mobility. Do you have any experience relating to literature and authors from Equatorial Guinea?
Sadly, I do not, but I would love to hear from Estelle about more of these connections, maybe in an email or another exchange. I think that would be wonderful to see. I mean, I'm not surprised to hear about, whenever I hear about kind of some of these diary forms, for example, that have cropped up across the continent and that look so similar. I don't think that's surprising, that especially when forms are circulating so quickly digitally, that you start to see these kinds of similarities. But even in terms of print, right? I mean, magazines like Drum crossed the continent and had this presence everywhere and were kind of responded to differently everywhere. So with, versions of these magazines being published in West Africa, and then instead in Southern Africa, different magazines cropping up like Parade or like OK Magazine in Malawi, another iteration of this kind of popular picture magazine. So these, one thing about these publications that I didn't talk about, but I think is so interesting, is that they're commercial, right? These aren't small magazines. These aren't little magazines that are, literary kind of without question. So they have that. But then, and they do travel widely. And Bolson's work, shows how this is a global form that has traveled. But these commercial magazines really had, even longer legs, I think, in terms of being able to reach mass audiences across the globe, because they had that commercial funding. And that's something that, even though writers aren't being paid on platforms like Wattpad and Facebook, someone's being paid, right? So it has this kind of economic basis that allows it to continue and sort of be sustained with new crops of writers just kind of coming in and coming out. So there is this sort of financial kind of incentive for this sort of literary publication that others have talked about is missing, right, in African literary publication. Some of Sarah Bruyette's work on this topic is seeing, there aren't local readers, and so it can't, and there's an economic problem, right, that can't be addressed. In this case, it kind of can be, so it's an interesting sort of way that, these forms are sort of shaking up the kind of economics of the publishing industry really completely.
Thank you for that. I will date myself here by admitting that in my childhood in Nigeria, we occasionally did have Drum magazine at home. So yes, Drum magazine definitely traveled very, very widely across the English-speaking parts of the African continent. Another question from Kiyu Chen, and Kiyu writes, I'm interested in the circulation of the self-help genre in the online digital print space. What are the emerging genres in these popular cultural platforms?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The self-help genre is so fascinating because it really does, straddle also kind of the print and digital spaces and kind of these, long centuries where you have, Stephanie Newell's work on this kind of self-help literature in a much earlier period and kind of the earlier 1900s. And so, well, yeah, I think even that early. But certainly by like the 1950s, right, you have this robust kind of self-help literature circulating in market literatures. So this is something that is just a perennial sort of favorite, I think, in some of these kinds of mass produced forms. You do see it certainly on Book Talk, on Bookstagram, but I'd say I've also kind of followed there's so much out there that you have to follow certain genres over others. So the biggest ones I encounter really are probably this kind of romance and fantasy kind of realm or the romantasy realm. Those are some of the most popular ones I've seen, although I know that the kind of self-help books are also very popular as well. But I'm also really interested in following some of these creators who are really trying to carve out new ideas of what, kind of classic African literary texts are. So to me, that's a really interesting part of this space where these influencers who might be working with other genres or kind of their daily posts might be in some of these more popular realms are also through lists and through just what they're recommending, usually in this very nice visual form, right, showing the books themselves, are really kind of shaping what the contemporary kind of African literary canon is. Or going back in time further and saying, no, let's think about what African classics are. So there's one really interesting creator, the Kosi Bookshelf, who I'm following, who's really thinking about what the classic is. And I find it just really, really interesting to see how that's kind of shaping ideas of African literature from South Africa, right? So really giving it kind of a location and an idea of what from this space kind of global African literature or looks like.
Thank you. First, a follow-up question from Estelle Finley, and then there are, I think, 2 additional questions that have come in. The follow-up from Estelle, has the podcast also become a media source for mobility? And I guess she means mobility, the kind of texts that travel from place to place. So you've spoken about these silent clubs, and the podcast is something different because someone is speaking, right?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean the podcast is a great, I think, other certainly could be a really interesting form of mobility to think about. I don't work with podcasts specifically. I know that Kate Wallace and Madhu Krishnan have an article about kind of podcasting as literary activism, I believe. So I would definitely direct you to their work. But I do think so. What been paying attention more to are these kinds of YouTube live broadcasts. So they can function, a lot of podcasts right now straddle this kind of visual and oral medium. So you can listen or you can watch and listen. So I think you do what I'm looking at more are these kinds of book discussions, or there's even people who get together and read on Zoom together, do like Pomodoros, and then have like chats about what they're reading. So there are different models that I think are really interesting. But podcasting specifically, I would have to direct you to kind of other work.
I think the conversation today is opening up all kinds of potential research projects for anyone who's watching and listening and thinking, I'd like to go into a different area of research in African literary studies. These are all areas that are begging for additional attention and investment of scholarship and time. So we have an additional question a different question from Marcy Uthaim, and Marcy says, in the examples you focused on, like commercial magazines, do you usually see the speculative or imaginative pieces treated as their own genre or more often integrated into other works? And Marcy's question calls to mind a question that I also had about genres and the way in which you just, you analyze genres in forms of mobility. Are you finding that the genres are recognized as such by the authors? Are they recognized as such by the readers? Are they recognized as such when and if they move into print? Or do people just think, I like a certain kind of story without naming it, giving it a name and saying it is this genre or that genre? I think your work raises up throws up all kinds of questions about the nature of genre and how certain collections of texts become identified as a genre.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll start with Marcy's question and then address this bigger question, although they are related. But yes, so this is also a great question about how these forms circulate, and oftentimes these some of the fictional forms, especially in early issues of Parade, aren't necessarily identified as such. So you might find kind of a page with readers' letters that include fiction, includes something like a folktale, an intano, something that's going to kind of straddle that line where it isn't clear, or letters that are written so as to be purposefully misleading, where, it's written by, the person accused, and it's a story about someone being accused. So you get a sense of this kind of playfulness, right? Or even others that don't have like a real, where people use pen names, or like Wezani, or this kind of repeating, like your name is actually, I'm repeating something I've been told. So there's this interesting way that fact or fiction are mixed up, even on a page on Parade called "Is it fact or fiction?" Right? So part though, I think what some of the editors of these magazines are doing in some ways is also getting readers to think about these questions. So they're asking readers to identify some of these materials and say, and make them kind of question what is fiction, what is not, how do I identify it? And then also, later in examples from the Malawi News, you have kind of literary criticism that appears alongside these serialized stories, and that really sort of questions sometimes what happened in the story and saying, that isn't right. That's not how the story is told. So the question of genre is really something that was being kind of either openly debated or kind of more subtly kind of questioned on these pages. And sometimes you'd see stories, they'd move categories within different issues of Parade. It would go from being a serialized story to just a feature that kind of had more of these questions around its veracity. So when I'm talking about kind of how these genres are identified, some of them are, like the diary chron is something that's being named, right, by these publishers, and so they're coming in as this kind of with their own incentives, right, for naming this particular genre, identifying it, seeing sort of these similar trends across all of this fiction, and sort of defining and naming it. In other cases, these are names that I've given to these genres because I think that helps me to capture sort of what I'm seeing in terms of how this particular set of forms is thinking about mobility in a similar way. Although whenever possible, I'm taking these kinds of names from kind of the literary criticism at the time, right? So the weekend stories was, again, something that came out of criticism surrounding the stories in the Malawi News, where people were saying, these are mere weekend stories. These are meant to be read and thrown away. And so then kind of also thinking about the real longevity that these stories had, because then they were published, some of them in national anthologies, right? And so they're really much more, they're canonized. And then also obviously the time machine category is something that comes out of the chronic, right? It's this idea of the newspaper as this low-tech time machine. So I'm trying to sort of play on the names that are being given to these forms by their creators, and to think about as much as possible the kinds of things that editors and critics were doing at the time in some of these publications, although some of this has to be kind of speculative, right? Because we don't necessarily have full insight into all of those decisions. But just in terms of, I don't know if that answers your broader question,
Well, it answers my broader question, but I'd like you to come back to Marcy's question about speculative fiction, and whether speculative fiction was treated as its own genre, or was just kind of like integrated into other kinds of fiction.
Oh, speculative fiction specifically. Yeah, sorry, I kind of edited out the speculative, I think, in my reading of that question. Apologies. Yeah, so speculative fiction, I mean, which obviously we've seen this big boom in the last 10, 15 years, is sometimes, yes, kind of being in some ways, I don't want to say siloed, but for a while it was appearing in its own kinds of magazines like Jungle Gym, I would say, where the emphasis was on speculative fiction. I mean, the Chronic is a very different sort of endeavor. They did have, I believe, a kind of speculative issue where, again, it's more focused on speculative fiction specifically, and I think magazines like Gelada have done something similar, where it does seem like there is a kind of, usually a sort of speculative issue that appears at some point in a variety of magazines. But that's, the fact that also sort of speculative fiction has been shortlisted for, the Kane Prize and other things, also shows that I don't think that there is this division, this hard division, right, between sort of the literary and the speculative. I would say, I mean, a lot of people kind of understand the speculative as being sort of new political writing, kind of being an incredibly important sort of writing that brings critique of current, socio-political systems and issues. So I don't see it as being necessarily separate, although I'd say in the publications specifically that I'm looking at, I've seen it kind of separated. But what's happening right at this current moment now, I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you. And I would say to, I think it's Marcy that asked the question. There is a magazine that you're probably aware of, Omanana, which is an online magazine, which is dedicated entirely to African speculative fiction. So worth looking at. Another question from Aaron Agorsor. And Aaron asks, among the forms of mobility, which one of them is the most dominant and why? That's a big question.
It's really an interesting question. Thank you so much for it. I mean, I hadn't thought in these terms, in terms of, in part because I think these forms are kind of separated in time and space. I'm wondering actually if the question is more about, I also talk about forms of mobility as these kinds of different factors that shape texts as they travel, in terms of thinking about, the geographic or the kind of medium of publication, things like that. So I'm not sure if that's kind of the spirit of the question, but I'd say it's hard to kind of see one particular kind of dominating sort of factor in terms of that would determine these forms in a certain way. I want to kind of stay away from thinking of these forms as determined by kind of their socio-political context, although they're certainly interacting with it and responding to it, and also helping to shape that context in various ways. So I think, for me, I guess one of the key factors is the medium of publication in terms of, being a kind of primary form that determines, where these texts travel, right? Where is the magazine being circulated? Although certainly these magazines circulated well beyond sort of the routes that were kind of even designated by their publishers or the distributors, because things tend to travel in kind of these sporadic hand-to-hand kind of ways. But there's also, the medium itself determined, in the case of African Parade, which languages were these stories appearing in. So, and also just very basic things like the length of the story, the serialization of the story, which also gave it this kind of particular, shape to the narrative. So I'd say ultimately the medium is very, very important in terms of, how these forms are traveling. So, if the medium is the message, how the medium travels matters to the message.
Indeed, indeed. Kiyu Chen has a comment and then a question. And Kiyu says, Dr. Santana's discussion of the circulation of Langston Hughes's simple stories in Southern Africa is super fascinating. I agree. In the forthcoming Jala special issue, are there any examples of such conversations between the continent and the diaspora? Do local magazines and digital spaces ever draw from African diasporic authors?
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of kind of permeability, kind of a supercharged kind of connectivity between continental and diasporic spaces because of these different digital platforms. So the text that Langston Hughes had to mail to writers, right, in South Africa, the drum writers who were then passing around these physical copies of his work, or these were things that took much longer, were much more kind of ephemeral and kind of precarious in a lot of ways than the connections that can be established now. And so it's actually through a lot of the book influencers that I'm, watching and engaging with now that I am learning about kind of conferences, like a huge romanticy conference that just happened in Atlanta, that I'm learning about kind of these other kind of TikTok influencers in the US. So yes, there's a lot of conversations happening. And, one of the closest things I've seen recently to Mike Maputo's diary in terms of the kind of sort of viral sort of presence that it had was Risa Tisa's TikTok, where she tells this very long story on TikTok. It's like 50 installments of these 10-minute videos where she talks about kind of a real experience she had with a man during the pandemic. And the comments on it are the closest thing I've seen to Maputo's diary, around just people kind of tuning in and saying, I'm here from South Africa I'm starting watching today. Who else is here with me? And then you'd get people from all over the continent, the globe, kind of tuning in and talking to one another and forming these like little groups within the comments to talk to one another. So there's definitely a lot of engagement across the diaspora around these forums.
Thank you. I have one of my own questions that I'd like to ask, just one of my own personal things that I'm interested in. You mentioned early on in your talk, you said that in your research, what you were looking at is not singular text, but masses of text that travel together. And you were reading them within the context, you were reading text within the context of a larger publication trajectory. And I find, just methodologically, I find this interesting. What do you see as the advantages of pursuing this kind of research in literary studies, where we are not doing the close reading of a singular text, but instead we're stepping back and we're looking at groups of texts in the ways in which they interact with each other or travel, as you happen to have said here?
Yeah, so I was really, thank you so much for that question, because I was really interested in some of these ideas around distant reading or surface reading and how that kind of applied to what I was doing. Or, also now kind of big data models, right? Where you can just go into these magazines and kind of, pull out key terms and sort of read in this non-reading way. But what I was inspired actually to see, and there's a footnote in the book about this, that before Franco Moretti called it distant reading, he actually thought about the term serial reading. And so that really spoke to me as a way of reading that is both kind of close and deep, but also done sort of in this way over time that can give you a sense of the larger publications, without sacrificing some of the closeness. So, I still do also this kind of close engagement with various texts in the book, and close reading. But I don't, but I do as much as possible try to take, this wider swath, like flipping through the entire magazine, right? To just get a sense of what the larger picture is. And I just think that's so important for platforms as well. Like I make my students go and read some of these diaries, and I'm like, you're gonna have to scroll for a really long time to get to the passages we're reading. And I think it's important though to go through that material and to see kind of what readers are engaging with, because you'll always find these other sorts of interesting exchanges between readers and authors, or just find out things about posting schedules that give you a sense of the kind of rhythm of these publications and what it meant to readers at the time to read them, right? It's a different experience reading a text when it's about crime, when it's appearing alongside an article asking you to become a policeman, right? Than it is just taking that text out of context. So, it is something that with the volume of material being produced, I think it does become more and more difficult, right, to do that kind of sort of deep yet wide reading. But I think, but for me, it meant focusing on certain publications rather than others, and trying to, have both the genres that I'm focalizing on, but then also kind of have the deep dive into the publications themselves as the kind of background.
Well, thank you very much for that response. Your project, your book, and your future projects raise all kinds of important questions for us as scholars in African literary studies. A lot of people online have written and have said their thank yous to you for the responses to the various questions that you've given. I'd like to thank our online audience on YouTube. Thank you for tuning in from all over the world to listen to the first in the series of the ALA lectures for the 2025-2026 year. Our next conversation is going to be on October 25th, 2025, and we will have Duncan Yoon in conversation with Gabriel Bangushe about Yoon's ALA award-winning monograph, China in 20th and 21st Century African Literature. At this point, I'm going to wish you all a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, as the case may be. And thank you for tuning in. And let me also put in a final word for the next issue of the Journal of the African Literature Association, which is guest edited by Stephanie Bosch Santana and a colleague from Germany, and which will be on African literature in African languages being published and circulated on social media. So be on the watch out for that. Thank you so much, and goodbye to everyone.